You made a mistake tonight. Not a big one. Nothing dramatic. You just decided, like millions of Americans do every single night, to scroll one more time before bed. Watch one more video. Stay up just a little later than you should. And now here you are. Phone in hand. Room dark. Everyone else in the house either asleep or gone. And you're about to listen to me tell you 3 stories that are going to make you look at your bedroom door differently for the rest of your life. I want to be upfront with you about something before we begin. Each of these stories has an ending. But not the kind of ending that wraps things up. Not the kind that lets you exhale and roll over and fall asleep easy. These endings leave something behind, a question, a detail, a silence that you're going to carry with you long after the video is over. You've been warned. Let's begin. Brenda Calloway was 41 years old, a registered nurse from outside Knoxville, Tennessee, when she first heard the scratching. She lived alone in a 2-story craftsman home she'd bought after her divorce. Her fresh start, she called it. She was proud of that house. She'd painted every room herself. She knew every sound it made, the way the furnace kicked on with a low thud, the way the upstairs bathroom pipes would moan if you ran the hot water too long, the particular groan of the 3rd step on the staircase. She knew her house the way you know a person after years of living with them. So when she heard something new, she noticed. It started on a Tuesday in late October. A scratching sound coming from inside the wall of her bedroom, the wall directly behind her headboard. Not loud, not frantic, slow and rhythmic, like someone dragging a single fingernail down the drywall from the other side. She assumed an animal. Squirrels get into walls all the time in older homes in Tennessee. She made a mental note to call an exterminator in the morning, rolled over, and went to sleep. The exterminator came. Found nothing. No entry points, no droppings, no nesting material. He tapped along the wall with a rubber mallet, pressed his ear against it, and told her with full confidence that there was nothing alive in that wall. He charged her $80 for the visit and left her standing alone in her bedroom feeling slightly embarrassed. That night, the scratching was louder. Brenda is a practical woman. She will tell you that herself. 31 years in nursing will do that to a person. It strips away sentimentality and replaces it with process. So she processed this the way she processed everything. She bought a stethoscope from a medical supply site. She already owned 3, but her good ones were at work, and she pressed it against the wall in the exact spot where the sound seemed loudest. What she heard stopped her cold. It wasn't scratching from inside the wall. The sound was coming from the other side of the wall. From outside the house. From the narrow gap between the exterior siding and the overgrown hedgerow that ran along that side of the foundation. Someone was crouching in the bushes beside her house, in the dead of night, dragging their fingers slowly up the exterior wall. Brenda did not panic. She stepped away from the wall, walked calmly to her kitchen, picked up her phone, and called 911 without turning on a single light. She told the dispatcher exactly what she'd heard and exactly where it was coming from. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived within 9 minutes. They found the hedgerow disturbed. Broken branches. Compressed ground. A coffee cup, paper, from a gas station 2 miles away, still faintly warm. Whoever had been there left before the deputies arrived. They canvassed the neighborhood. They found nothing. For the next 3 weeks, nothing happened. No scratching. No disturbances. Brenda began to breathe again. She told herself it had been a one-time thing. A vagrant. A troubled person passing through. She had the hedgerow cut back to nothing and motion sensor lights installed on every exterior wall of her home. And then on a Wednesday night in November, she got a knock at the front door. It was her neighbor from 4 houses down, a retired schoolteacher named Donna who Brenda had spoken to maybe a dozen times in 2 years. Donna was holding her phone out, face pale, looking at Brenda with an expression Brenda described to us as the look someone gives you right before they deliver a diagnosis you didn't expect. Donna had a neighborhood watch app on her phone, one of those apps where residents share photos of suspicious activity. She said she'd meant to show Brenda for weeks, but kept forgetting. She handed Brenda the phone. There were 11 photos, all taken at night, all of them showing the exterior of Brenda's house, the side with the hedgerow. And in several of them, barely visible in the shadows between the bushes and the siding, there was a figure. Crouching. Still. Face turned toward the bedroom window. The timestamps on the photos spanned 19 days. The earliest one was taken 3 days before Brenda ever heard the first scratch. He had been watching her for nearly 3 weeks before she ever knew he was there. A man from a neighboring county with a prior history that the sheriff's department would not fully disclose to Brenda. He was eventually identified through forensic evidence left at the scene and arrested on charges that have since resulted in a conviction. Brenda Calloway still lives in that house. She will tell you she refused to let him take it from her. But she also told us something she says she's never said out loud to anyone else. On the nights she can't sleep, the nights she lies there in the dark listening to her house settle, she still sometimes reaches for the stethoscope on her nightstand. Not because she hears anything, because she needs to be sure. This next story comes from a man named Kevin, 34 years old, living in suburban Ohio. He submitted it to us 18 months ago, and it took us that long to verify enough of the surrounding details before we felt right about sharing it. Kevin has given us permission to tell it exactly as he told us. He asked only that we not use his last name because, and I'm quoting him directly here, "Some parts of this I still can't explain, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life being asked to." Kevin was 16 years old when this happened. It was a Friday night in February, and his father, a long-haul truck driver named Gary, was somewhere in Kansas on a run that would keep him on the road until Sunday. Kevin was home with his younger sister, who was 12, and their mother, who had gone to bed early with a migraine. The kind that knocked her completely out. She'd taken her prescription and was genuinely unreachable until morning. Kevin was up late watching TV in the living room when his phone buzzed. A call from his dad's cell. He answered without thinking twice. His dad's voice came through clear and calm, the way it always did on road calls. He asked how things were at home, how his sister was doing, whether their mom had eaten dinner. Normal stuff. The call lasted maybe 4 minutes. At the end of it, his dad said, "Lock up tight tonight," which Kevin says was just something his dad always said when he called from the road, a habit, a ritual. Kevin said goodnight, hung up, locked the front and back doors, and went to bed. Saturday morning, he came downstairs to find his mother in the kitchen, and she was staring at her own phone with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. His father had called her that morning from a hospital in Salina, Kansas. Gary had been in a serious accident Friday evening, a blowout on an icy overpass. The truck had gone through a guardrail. He'd been airlifted to a regional trauma center and had been unconscious and in surgery from approximately 8:45 p.m. Friday until 4 a.m. Saturday morning. Kevin felt the air leave the room. He checked his own phone. The call from his father's number was logged at 10:22 p.m. Friday night. His father had been on an operating table. Kevin says he has spent nearly 2 decades trying to work through what happened that night. He's gone back and forth between explanations. Maybe his father called before the accident and the timestamp on his phone was wrong. Maybe it was a network delay. Calls sometimes log strangely on cell towers in rural areas. Maybe his mind has filled in details that weren't actually there because the alternative is something he isn't prepared to hold on to. But then he comes back to 2 things he cannot explain away. The first is that his father's phone was recovered from the crash site, and the call records retrieved by the carrier showed no outgoing call made to Kevin's number that night. Not before the accident. Not during. Not at all. The second is the thing his father said at the end. "Lock up tight tonight." Because when Kevin's mother told investigators what time Gary's truck had gone through that guardrail, it was 8:43 p.m. An hour and 39 minutes before Kevin's phone rang with his father's voice on the other end of it. Gary survived. He spent 6 weeks in rehabilitation, walked with a cane for a while, and has been back behind the wheel for over a decade now. Kevin says his dad has no memory of the night of the accident beyond pulling onto the overpass. He doesn't know about the phone call. Kevin has never told him. He's never been able to figure out what he would say. Only this: that night, after he hung up, he locked the front door and the back door exactly as he was told. And he's never once been able to fully convince himself that the thing on the other end of that phone call wasn't, in some way that defies every rational framework he has, his father. I want to take a moment before this last story to say something directly. This is the one that made 2 members of our team want to pull the episode. Not because it's gory, it isn't. Not because it's far-fetched, it's actually the most thoroughly documented of the 3. It made them uncomfortable because of what it suggests. Not about monsters, not about the supernatural, but about ordinary life. About the spaces we move through every day without questioning them. Once you hear this, you're going to think about it the next time you walk into a room that feels slightly wrong, and you can't explain why. Here is the story of a woman I'll call Mara. Mara was 29 years old, a graduate student in Portland, Oregon, living in a rented 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that was old enough to have character, but new enough to feel safe. She had a roommate, her friend from college, I'll call her Jess, and by all accounts it was a good living situation. Quiet building, decent neighbors, reasonable landlord. In January of that year, Jess moved out unexpectedly. A family situation that required her to be in a different state. Mara suddenly found herself alone in an apartment with a second bedroom she wasn't using, a rent she could barely cover solo, and, as she describes it, a very sudden, very specific feeling of unease she couldn't pin to anything. She told herself it was adjustment. The apartment felt different when you were alone in it. Sounds you'd never noticed before became noticeable. Silence had a different quality. This is normal. This is what happens when you go from two people in a space to one. She started sleeping with the TV on, a habit she'd never had before. She told herself it was for the noise. For weeks after Jess moved out, Mara found a coffee mug in the drying rack next to her sink that she had no memory of washing. She'd had coffee that morning. She remembered that clearly, but the mug she used was still in the cabinet. This was a second mug, rinsed clean, placed neatly in the rack as if it had been there for hours. She stood in her kitchen for a long time looking at it. She threw it away. The following week, she noticed that the blanket she kept folded on the back of her couch had been moved to the couch cushions, laid out flat, as if someone had been using it and folded it back loosely before she came home. She had left it on the back of the couch that morning. She was certain. She called her landlord and asked if anyone had been in the apartment while she was out. Maintenance, inspectors, anyone. He checked his records and told her no. She started keeping a log. A notes app on her phone, just small things, small observations, dated and time-stamped. The pen that was on her desk in the morning and on her coffee table when she got home from class. The window in her bedroom that she closed before leaving and found open a half-inch when she returned. The faint smell of cigarette smoke once, for just a moment, in the hallway outside the bathroom. Nobody in that building smoked. After 6 weeks of logging, she went to the building manager, not the landlord, the on-site manager who handled day-to-day operations, and she laid out everything she'd noted. She expected to be dismissed. She was not. The manager walked through the apartment with her, and in the back of the second bedroom closet, the one Jess had used, the one that had been empty since she left, behind a low shelf near the baseboard, they found a door. Not a hidden door in the dramatic sense. A utility access panel, about 2 feet by 3 feet, with a simple latch. Standard in buildings of that age, used for accessing plumbing and electrical runs between units. Mara had never known it was there. The shelf had been blocking it. The latch was not locked. When the manager opened it and put a flashlight inside, they found a narrow crawl space running between Mara's apartment and the unoccupied unit next door. Wide enough for a person to move through if they were willing to hunch down. Maybe 4 feet of clearance. Inside the crawl space, there was a sleeping bag and a coffee mug. Portland police responded within 20 minutes. The unoccupied neighboring unit had been accessed through a window that faced the building's interior courtyard, out of sight from the street. The tenant of record had vacated months earlier. The unit had been sitting empty on the rental market. Whoever had been living in that crawl space between the walls of Mara's apartment, moving into her home when she left, drinking coffee in her kitchen, using her blanket on her couch, sleeping a few feet away from her bedroom wall, was never found. They were never identified. Mara moved out within the week. She left everything she couldn't carry in one trip, and she never went back. She told us one last thing before we ended our conversation, and I want to share it exactly as she said it. She said, "The thing that still gets me isn't the fear. I've processed the fear. What I haven't processed is that for almost 6 weeks, I felt like something was wrong and I kept explaining it away. Every single time, I talked myself out of trusting what I felt. The mug, the blanket, the smell, I explained every single one. And the whole time I was right." She paused. Then she said, "We're really good at not believing ourselves, aren't we?" 3 stories. A nurse who learned to listen to her own walls. A son who can never know for certain, who called him on the worst night of his family's life. A woman who spent 6 weeks explaining away the truth that was sleeping inside her home. None of these endings are clean. I told you that at the start, and I meant it. There's no resolution here that puts everything back in its place. That's not what these stories are. They're not entertainment designed to scare you and then release you. They're accounts from real people who are still, right now, tonight, living inside the aftermath of something they cannot fully explain. And maybe that's the thing that makes them worth telling. Not the horror, but the honesty. The reminder that the gap between what we know and what is actually happening around us is sometimes smaller than we'd like it to be, and sometimes much, much larger. Check your doors tonight. Trust the feeling when a room seems wrong, and you can't say why. And if something wakes you up at 2 a.m. and you can't identify the sound, pay attention. If you made it to the end of this one, you already know this channel is where you belong. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new story when we post. And if something has happened to you, something real, something you've never been able to explain, something that still keeps you up at night, leave it in the comments below or reach out through our community tab. We read every single one, and sometimes they end up right here. Good night.